start tonight's broadcast with the Supreme Court keeping the anti-terror law largely intact, save for a few key provisions. Voting 12-3, magistrates struck down parts of Section 4, which defines terrorism. It finds overbroad and violative of freedom of expression the phrase, which are not intended to cause death or serious physical harm to a person, to endanger a person's life, or to create a serious risk to public safety. End of quote.
The High Tribunal, with a vote of 9-6, also junked the second method for designation under Section 25. The method would have allowed the Anti-Terrorism Council to designate terrorists based on requests made by another country or jurisdiction and upon meeting criteria set by the United Nations Security Council resolution. Good evening. I'm Maricel Halidi.
I'm Robbie Alampa. You're watching The Big Story. After months of waiting, it's come to this in what petitioners are describing as a limited victory. The Supreme Court scrapped two portions of the anti-terror law.
The decision upholds several other provisions that were challenged by oppositors. For petitioners, this only means that the fight is not yet over. Mobile journalist Jacob Lazaro gives us a front seat to the big story.
It's the most contested law to date, with 37 petitions filed against it with the Supreme Court. On Tuesday, the Supreme Court voted to strike down only two portions of Republic Act 11479, or the Anti-Terrorism Law of 2020. The first is a qualifier that exempts advocacy and protests from the definition of terrorism. The High Court said the line which are not intended to cause death or physical harm to a person or endanger a person's life is too broad and violates freedom of expression. The second refers to requests by international groups for the Philippine government to designate certain Filipinos as terrorists. Petitioner Attorney Nery Colmenares calls it a partial victory for oppositors of the law. But more important than what was struck down were the provisions that were upheld by the Supreme Court. The Office of the Solicitor General pointed out that the High Court declared all 58 provisions of the anti-terror law as constitutional. Interior Secretary Eduardo Año said the DILG will just make appropriate adjustments in the implementation of the law. Former NTF-ELCAC spokesman retired General Antonio Parlade agreed with the need to remove those two portions of the law.
It could be abuse. For instance, may namatay because of dissent. Baka ma-charge yung mga nagrally dito sa terrorism law. So hindi naman siguro tama yon.
Other controversial provisions questioned by the petitioners were left untouched. The Supreme Court allowed the Anti-Terrorism Council to designate terror groups based on probable cause and cause the freezing of their assets. Also, Section 29, which allows warrantless arrests up to 24 days.
Shouldn't there be a court proceeding where the court will decide whether or not, based on evidence, I'm a terrorist?
But Parlade said, even without going through the courts, the ATC still makes heavy investigation before they press charges.
May investigation yan. And then there's a lot that you need to do actually before serving a warrant.
Colmenares worries the law is still vulnerable to abuse. The petitioners still plan to appeal the decision, but need to wait for the High Tribunal to release the court ruling. Mobile journalist Jacob Lazaro, we are One News.
What's next then for those still seeking to challenge other provisions of the anti-terror law? That big question and more with one of the petitioners against the measure, former Integrated Bar of the Philippines President Attorney Domingo Egon Cayosa. Attorney Cayosa, welcome to The Big Story.
Good evening, Robbie, and good evening to your listeners and viewers.
So, Attorney Cayosa, para po sa mga nag-challenge dito sa anti-terror law, is this a net victory or is it a net disappointment?
A very limited victory, and I personally am disappointed that the more controversial provisions that we question as being unconstitutional were not declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court.
Which in particular still gives everybody fits and that you feel is still very important to challenge?
One is the very broad definition of what a terroristic act is. Secondly, the undue giving of power to the Anti-Terrorism Council to authorize the warrantless arrest of individuals. Third is the detention of suspects for up to 24 days when the Constitution, even in extreme situations where the writ of the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus is suspended, it only gives government 3 days and they have to be charged. So these are the more controversial provisions. The other one, of course, are those provisions that allow the government to conduct uh, surveillance on mere suspicion, and also freezing of assets of persons suspected of being terrorists ex parte. So these are to my mind, the more controversial provisions, and they were largely left untouched by the Supreme Court, meaning to say they were not declared unconstitutional.
Now, pending continuing challenges and motions for reconsideration, what is the status of the law right now? And government is saying, baka pwede natin daanin ngayon yan. We'll take it. They're saying 58 provisions, constitutional naman, 2 unconstitutional. We're expecting challenges. And government is now saying, baka naman pwedeng daanan natin sa IRR yan. What is the status of the law right now? And to all intents and purposes, what can government do with it?
Well, the government cannot correct the provisions declared unconstitutional by mere IRR. The law has to be amended, but if Congress doesn't wish to amend the law, then those 2 provisions which were declared unconstitutional are invalid. But of course, most of the provisions of the law were left untouched. They were not declared unconstitutional, so government at this point can continue implementing those provisions of the Anti-Terrorism Act.
Okay, maraming salamat po, Attorney Egon Cayosa. After being signed into law on July 3, 2020, the anti-terror law has already been used against several individuals and groups. The first known anti-terror law case was filed against 2 ITAs who were charged with terrorism for allegedly shooting soldiers. Japper Gurung and Junior Ramos were accused of firing at members of the 73rd Division Reconnaissance Company of the 7th Infantry Division on August 2020. The Olongapo Regional Trial Court later junked the case, ruling that it was a case of mistaken identities. An anti-terror law case was also filed against 4 farmers from Occidental Mindoro for allegedly protecting NPA combatants. Miguel Domingo Manguera, Feser Namariñas, Cerdita Casidsid, and Allen de la Fuente were also charged last July for allegedly providing material support to terrorists and for being accessories to terrorism. Lastly, the country's Anti-Terrorism Council designated the Communist Party of the Philippines, New People's Army, and the National Democratic Front as terrorists. The designation means that government has the power to freeze their assets. In May, the ATC also designated 10 affiliates of local terrorist groups and 19 members of the CPP-NPA as terrorists.
These are the other big stories tonight. The Philippines remains Omicron-free based on the latest round of genome sequencing. 57 countries have already reported cases of the new variant, and the World Health Organization expects the list to grow. For some good news, Pfizer-BioNTech says a 3rd dose of their vaccine may be effective in neutralizing the Omicron variant. And local pop group SB19 made it to the global top Google searches in 2021. COVID prevention is also the most searched topic among Filipinos. These big stories after the break.
evening. You're still watching The Big Story. I'm Robbie Alampay.
And I'm Maricel Halili. The health secretary himself is echoing sentiments that COVID-19 might be endemic in the Philippines by next year. But that's if no new deadly variant emerges.
Speaking of new variants, the country has yet to report a case of the Omicron variant, which the WHO says could alter the course of the pandemic. JC Cosico with the story.
As COVID infections wane and more Filipinos getting jabbed, the health department thinks it's highly likely for COVID-19 to be endemic in the Philippines by next year.
It's possible if we can keep the cases down and hopefully the variants will not be as dangerous as, Delta was really a bad variant. No? In fact, even Alpha overwhelmed us. So sana wag na pong magkaroon ng matinding mga mutations at variants.
But Dr. Rizal Liner of Hospital na Maynila cautions about the use of the word endemic. He tells The Big Story that this might only lead to overcomplacency. And besides, the country has yet to reach herd immunity.
Baka mamaya isipin ng mga tao, uy, okay na tayo, sige tanggalin na natin yung mask. Bigla mo ibababa yung yung iyong protection. Delikado 'yon. Kasi nga premature pa lang po yung mga data, yung pong mga nalalaman natin tungkol dito kay Omicron. So kailangan doble ingat pa nga tayo dapat.
To date, no Omicron variant case has been detected in the Philippines. Among the 48 samples sequenced on Wednesday, 38 were positive for Delta while the rest had no lineage. Of this number, 31 were local cases while 7 were returning overseas Filipinos. The World Health Organization meanwhile reported that the Omicron variant has already been detected in 57 countries and that number is expected to grow.
Don't wait. Act now. Its global spread and large number of mutations suggest it could have a major impact on the course of the pandemic.
For now, governments were told to reassess their COVID-19 responses and speed up inoculation to combat Omicron.
Any complacency now will cost lives. Many of those who don't die could be left battling long COVID or post-COVID condition, a disease with debilitating, lingering symptoms that we're only beginning to understand.
For News 5, JC Cosico, We Are One News.
Despite earlier fears, studies now show that the Omicron variant may not be that resistant against vaccines. BioNTech and Pfizer say a third shot of their COVID-19 vaccine was able to neutralize the Omicron variant. Preliminary studies show that a booster shot of the said jab could increase protection against the new variant. An Omicron-targeted vaccine is also being studied by the two manufacturers.
We are already developing the Omicron-adapted vaccine and are in the midst of development. The timelines are such that we would be delivery ready with an Omicron-adapted vaccine by March next year, pending regulatory authorization.
The Omicron scare is still not felt here, as evidenced by the heavy traffic in Metro Manila. And with the holiday rush kicking in, authorities have crafted new protocols on capacity in public transportation. Marian Enriquez breaks it down for us.
Roads are once again busy amid the easing of restrictions in Metro Manila, making rush hours very difficult for bus drivers like Philip. He often finds himself loading more passengers, exceeding the allowed 70% seating capacity.
Siyempre, bugsuan ng pasahero. Kami ang inaaway rin ng pasahero pag di namin sinakay.
Philip and other bus drivers are appealing to the IATF to once again allow full capacity in public transportation.
Para 100% na po. Total, yung mga tao, mga empleyado, may mga vaccine na yan.
But the Interagency Council for Traffic still will not budge. They conducted an operation against overloading PUVs in C5 Taguig.
Wala na magawa sir, lang. Ngayon nga lang kami makabawi sa biyahe sir. Hindi muna patiketan, warning na lang muna.
A driver admitted that he is confused with the different guidelines per region.
Akala ko kasi sir, nasa 100% na tayo kasi nasa LGCQ ng Laguna eh. Kaya hindi po natin, may iba-iba kasi mga sinasabi ng mga hindi natin maintindihan.
In time for the holiday season, the LTFRB released new guidelines on passenger capacity for PUVs nationwide. Jeepneys, buses, and UV Express will be allowed to increase their seating capacity, but with one condition. Currently, the seating capacity in Metro Manila, Rizal, Bulacan, Laguna, and Cavite remains at 70%. For regions with 50% passenger capacity in PUVs, the LTFRB said passenger load may be raised to 70% if they have reached 30% vaccination rate. The LTFRB has also set rules on passenger capacity for inter-regional routes. PUVs going to Metro Manila should observe the allowed passenger capacity from their place of origin, while for those coming from NCR should follow the capacity of the trip's endpoint. Meanwhile, inter-regional routes that will not traverse Metro Manila should follow the lowest passenger capacity in the concerned regions. This will be implemented from December 9 to January 4, 2022. For News 5, Marian Enriquez, we are One News.
For the big story in sports in the PBA, the Phoenix Fuel Masters found their fire late in the game, outgunning Tira Firma Jeep in a stunning 103-100 comeback win. Matthew Wright led the late game run, dropping 13 of his 17 points in the fourth, completing the Fuel Masters comeback from a 17-point deficit. Phoenix win also spoiled the debut of Alex Cabagnot with a Jeep. In the second game, the rain or shine Elasto Painters cruised past the Blackwater Bossing for a 92-79 victory. Reynam Batak led the way for the Elasto Painters with 16 points, 4 rebounds, and 2 assists. Blackwater, meanwhile, continues its 20-game losing streak. The UK and Canada have become the latest nations to announce a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Winter Olympics. This comes after similar announcements by the US and Australia earlier this week. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson said no ministers will attend due to alleged human rights abuses in China. Canada later followed suit, also citing the same reasons. IOC President Thomas Bach said that despite the political boycotts, the IOC is pleased that athletes will still take part in the tournament.
Tuloy pa rin ang Pasko still rings true for the people of Alaminos, Pangasinan, as the Metro Pacific Investments Foundation visited the province for a second time to hand out business packages. Residents were initially given bicycles during the first round of Metro Pacific's visit, but this time they were given stalls on wheels. Cash and Christmas baskets were also handed out. In San Vicente National High School, the foundation gave a brand new high-powered shredder machine in support of their sustainable vegetable farm program. 5,000 mangroves were also planted in Alaminos. Time for another quick break. When we return, scammers now target political aspirants in next year's polls, promising a sure win by tampering with election results. If you're like most people around the globe, you must have Googled BTS and Squid Game at one point this year. Google just dropped its most searched topics for 2021. And Pantone came up with a new U for its color of the year. The newly created Very Peri is meant to symbolize the world's transformation. These big stories after the break.
Good evening. You're still watching The Big Story. I'm Robbie Alampay.
And I'm Maricel Halili. Scammers are approaching political aspirants, claiming that they can alter election results to ensure victory.
But the COMELEC is standing by their source code, saying they're tamper-proof. Greg Gregorio has the story.
Some politicians are turning to COMELEC to complain about people claiming to be capable of tampering with election results. They were offered a supposed guaranteed victory in exchange for huge sums of money. COMELEC spokesman James Jimenez says this kind of scam has been around since the 2010 automated elections.
That way, whoever wins, wins. Whoever loses, gets a refund. Right? So parang akala mo talaga may nagawa or may nangyari. Pero walang nangyari.
Presidential aspirant and Manila Mayor Isko Moreno admits that he was offered such a deal. He warns his fellow candidates.
We must continue to believe in our system. The system may not be perfect, but it's there. It's functioning.
COMELEC has time and again said that tampering of election results is impossible. The source codes, which are now kept at a vote in COMELEC, will also be deposited at the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas.
The codes held by the IBD both are accompanied by unique hash codes, which will be published in the COMELEC website to allow people to check for themselves.
But election watchdog Contra Daya isn't sold.
Sometimes cheating may be done not by individual counting, but after a certain frequency count. In programming, anything is possible, and if you're creative enough,
Contra Daya wants an open source code review where anyone may scrutinize the codes, but Arrow notes that reviewers must only be allowed to read, download, and execute access so as not to compromise the security of the polls. The COMELEC previously mentioned that the installable software may only be altered if a major problem occurs during the field test, the mock elections, or when local source code reviewers detect other critical issues. For News 5, Greg Gregorio, we are One News.
Here are the other election-related stories we're watching. Former Chief Presidential Legal Counsel Salvador Panelo tells the chiefs that President Duterte will be endorsing a new presidential bet soon. He says, however, that his next pick may not be on the current lineup. The filing for substitution has already lapsed. Meanwhile, Vice Presidential bet and Davao City Mayor Sara Duterte meets with 9 incumbent city mayors in NCR. In a statement released by Hugpong ng Pagbabago, the presidential daughter and the local chief executives shared a lunch at a hotel in Ortigas. Presidential aspirant Panfilo Lacson, also the principal author of the anti-terror law, is delighted with the Supreme Court's decision. He says the decision is tantamount to choosing peace over terror. Meanwhile, Vice President Leni Robredo is hopeful the SC will address petitioners' other concerns too. According to Robredo, this law should not be used to suppress freedom of expression or legitimate dissent.
After Spotify Wrapped and TikTok year-end video, tech giant Google just released its annual year-end search list for 2021. Like every year, Google revisits the top search trends on the platform across more than 70 countries. In the Philippines, lookups for COVID-19 prevention tops the list for overall trending searches. South Korea's globally acclaimed Squid Games and K-drama True Beauty also made the cut. In news, meanwhile, vaccine certification, Miss Universe 2021, and Tokyo Olympics are among the list. Globally, Pinoy idol group SB19's song Mapa entered the top searches for trending songs this year. With them are rising star Olivia Rodrigo and K-pop superstars BTS. SB19 has recently made history for being the first Pinoy act to be nominated for Top Social Artist at the Billboard Music Awards. Overall, Google released lists for personalities, sports, and entertainment too. For News 5, MJ Marfori, we are One News.
Already looking forward to 2022. To usher in the upcoming year, the Pantone Color Institute introduced Very Berry as its color of the year for 2022.
The introduction of Very Peri marks the first time in the company's 22-year history that they manufactured a new color instead of choosing from their pre-existing archive. Pantone introduced a new color for 2022 as a dynamic periwinkle blue hue with a vivifying violet-red undertone. They said that the new color is the happiest and warmest of all the blue hues that introduces an empowering mix of newness.
Pantone adds that the intriguing color also helps us embrace the altered landscapes of possibilities, opening us up to a new vision as we rewrite our lives. This, of course, as countries across the globe continue to fight the COVID-19 pandemic.
So pwede siyang theme sa Christmas tree.
Ewan ko eh. Isa yan sa mga, speaking of top Google searches, siguro kailangan ko i-Google yun. Hindi ko magets kung ano yung kakaiba doon.
Yung difference niya sa ibang shade ng blue.
Pero pansinin mo yung isang top search, Backsearch PH. You know, what that tells us is, ang daming gustong umuwi. Diba? At saka marami rin gustong mag-travel.
Oo nga. Kasi nakakamiss naman talaga. Pero limited muna ngayon. Hindi pa sila pwedeng bumalik dito. Nadagdag pa yung France sa red list. 16 days to go before Christmas. Tuloy pa rin ang Pasko mga kapatid. And that wraps up today's big story. Catch us again tomorrow at 8 p.m. on Signal Channels 8 and 250.
Please like our Facebook page, One News. For more in-depth analysis, visit our webpage, onenews.ph. Mask on.
Wash hands.
And stay safe, Philippines. I'm Robbie Alampay.
And on behalf of Gretchen Ho, I'm Maricel Halili. We are One News. Good evening.